Welcome to the Forge, my wanton wildlings. I'm your creepsmith, and I hope you like my work.
Hey kids, ask anyone over 35 and they'll tell you, progress can be a bitch. This can be especially true if we choose to view the developments of the past as inferior to, rather than foundational to, the developments of modernity. This mindset may encourage one to forget things that they should not. Think about that as you're enjoying tonight's story by the ever-eloquent Xylonex, the Orobas ritual. They say that if you stare into the abyss, it stares back at you. Well, I stared into the abyss and all I saw was a mirror. To be a bit more specific, I stared into that mirror with a candle in my hand and stared into the inky blackness behind my reflected face. The full-length mirror on the back of my bedroom door seemed like a monolith as I knelt before it with a single candle clasped between my hands. I knelt there and I chanted. I wanted to believe the story that I'd been told, but I also wanted it to be wrong. My friend Glenn had walked me through the ritual. I was to kneel before a mirror in a dark room with both hands clasped around a lit candle. Once I was able to see the reflection of the flame shining in my own eyes, I was to stare into my reflected eyes and chant a single line until I heard a voice say, "Petite et dabitur vobis." Once I heard that voice, I could ask a single question and receive a 100% truthful answer from an all-knowing demon. It was a long shot, but I had a question that had been eating away at me for months. I had all but given up hope of finding an answer when I mentioned it to Glenn and he told me about this ritual. I figured it to be unlikely, but I wasn't willing to rule it out. As I stared into the mirror, I chanted, "Orobas veritatem revelandam." I chanted and chanted as I stared into my own eyes and watched the candlelight flicker in their reflection. This continued for nearly 10 minutes before a gust of wind came from nowhere and left me in complete darkness. I was getting ready to stand up and flip the light switch when I heard an ethereal voice say, "Petite et dabitur vobis." Slowly, an image formed on the mirror in front of me. It seemed more like a horse than a man, but as I stared at it, he simply stared back at me. Glenn had given me instructions for that part of the ritual as well. I quickly reached down to my side and grabbed a composition notebook and an unopened pack of pens and slid them toward the mirror as an offering. The horseman reached down and grabbed them before saying, "Quid est quod queris?" I tried to summon the courage to speak, but all I could summon was a whisper as I said, "Would you please speak English? I only know the Latin that Glenn showed me." The horseman replied, "What is your question?" Feeling a bit bolder, I asked, "How can I be happy again?" The horseman laughed and said, "I am not permitted to lie, nor can I refuse to answer, but this is not an answer that will please you." I shot back, "What is that supposed to mean?" The horseman responded, "It is what it is. You will not be pleased when I tell you that you will never find happiness again. I am not permitted to lie, nor can I refuse to answer." I shouted back, "Why won't I ever be happy again?" The horseman replied sternly, "You are afforded one question, and 2 questions were answered. Release me and go forward with this knowledge." I replied, "I will not release you until you tell me why I'll never be happy again." Fire billowed from his nostrils as he took the shape of a large horse in the mirror and shook the glass as he flared those nostrils. The room glowed in the orange light of the flames as he shouted, "Et non moreris et diebus septem! Hic est elime pretium!" I shouted, I don't understand you. Speak English. The horseman reverted back to the form of a man with a mane of fire as he slammed his hand against the glass and shouted, "Dimitri me! Release me!" By this point, any courage that I had fled in terror. I stumbled through the words as I said the final line that Glenn had given me. Et nunc absolvo vos. With that, the spirit left and the moonlight began to shine through the window behind me. Having had more of an experience than I had expected, I went to bed. The following morning, I caught up to Glenn at school and told him about my experience. His expression turned to one of stark terror when I repeated the Latin that the horseman had shouted at me. When I asked him what had him so spooked, Glenn simply asked, "You remembered to write 'You cannot harm me' in the notebook like I asked, right?" I hadn't, but I nodded. Glenn sighed in relief and said, "Then you have nothing to worry about. If you don't write a command in the notebook, the demon can choose your fate." I still don't know what the horseman said to me. Oh. Yeah. Don't worry if you had to look up that phrase on Google Translate. I did too. That's some harsh stuff, kids. If you're wondering, the only part of that phrase that I actually understood was diebus septem. So, stay scary, my wildlings. Don't call up something you don't understand, and make the most of your nights.